Thanks, Alessandro. I'm glad to be there in a virtual way. I hope you will forgive me for my English. That is very far from being perfect. However, in each slide there will be some text. So if I won't be able to explain myself to let's say be clear, probably the text will help us to understand something. As Alessandro anticipated a little bit before, my lecture won't be about highways. It will be a more general reflection about the issue of velocity. That was one of my old interest of research. So this is the cover of the book that Alessandro quoted before. It is a book quite old right now, and I'm starting telling something about it. Oh, okay. So the book started from this column that I held on Arkit. That was the online magazine, maybe the most widespread in Italy at the beginning of the 2000s. And this keyword column was sort of game for me. I was a young researcher at the Faculty of Architecture in Ferrara. One of my duty was to buy books for the library. So I was pushed to different terrains, different than my usual research interests. And so I had the need to collect all the information I was studying about, all the books that I was browsing. So I built this sort of files or text that try to connect all the dots I was collecting. So I started, you see, there is a sort of table of contents of those keywords about the things that I was collecting, looking at the last publication on the within the architectural debate. So thanks to Alessandro, who was the publishing director of a new publisher in Milan in those years, I published it in maybe 2008. I don't remember the date. This book, Ex Libris, which was the collection of the 16 keywords I wrote. Or more precisely, there were maybe 12 keywords published online and some new keywords in order to finish and organize the book. So this is the English edition, which is a sort of updated text. You will see how it is updated. That collects all the 16 keywords of the Italian edition. So this is how the keywords are built up. You know, my grandfather was the owner of a pharmacy, so he was a chemist, and this idea of producing a sort of medicine is a sort of approach that I used also in other books. And so I try to formulate the content of each keyword like a medicine. So it is in Italy it is called the bugiardino, so the little liar. So this is what a medicine is supposed to do. So there is a sort of rule of the game. So the keyword is always more or less 2,000 words, with more or less 30 references, with a 15% of Italian reference, and the whole book collects a total of more than 1,000 references, with reference to authors, groups, and movements also more than 1,000. So let's go on, because you will see those are the keywords. You see this. There is also the keyword dictionary, but you see there are very few normal architectural issues. Of course, there are some of them, like context or maybe density or surface, but the other ones are in a way drawn from the debate. So there is a sort of the presumption to have no bias about the architectural debate, and to collect things that were in a way hot in that moment. Okay, let's go on. This is the text that so generously Alessandro put in the text, so you can read something of his. And this is the keyword. You see that the book is a sort of hypertext. There are always the possibility of connection between different arguments, and there is always the connection with bibliography. And I have to thanks again Alessandro, because the structure of the book was a big discussion among us, and so one of the beautiful things to do books with smart people is that the like for the architectural projects, the things grow up in a smart way among the discussion between people, among the people. Okay, so let's go on. And each keyword has a postscriptum. In this postscriptum, there is the possibility to upgrade, to update the things. So in the new edition, I added some books, you see, published after 2008, so the date of the first publication. So there is the possibility also to also for the people who read who buy or read this book, to update, connecting and adding their own references, the new ones. Okay, let's go on. So you see these keywords work also like metro lines. There are books that are sort of hubs that connects with other keywords. You see this one by Remkola is very connecting. There is the possibility to connect with many other arguments, and you see there are always the possibility within the reading a text to switch to other arguments along the book. So let's start with this presentation. The first issue is about duration, because traditionally, when we approach every theory of architecture, and especially Vitruvius, the idea of duration is embedded in the approach of architecture. We are going to design things in order that they last for a long time, usually. Even in other cultures, when this idea of duration is approached with other strategies, there is also always the idea of making things that last in times. In this Ise temple in Japan, the temple is always new, but the old temple is the template to build the new one. So in a way, it is as old as new. Vitruvius, of course, is a reference, because in his triad about architecture, Firmitas, Utilitas, Venusta, the first term is about durability. Firmitas is about the solidity of the the architecture, but it is also about the architecture that is something that stays still, that stands in a place and stays still for a long time. But we know that in the present times, our experience is of a very fast, volatile, mobile world. And this idea has challenged us in many ways, even about the velocity, the quickness of building, and even our idea of construction and also of durability of things has been challenged by this new experience. Even the idea of place is challenging. This is a Venturi's house that has been moved about maybe 50 or 100 kilometers from the previous place because it was about to be sold and demolished. So another client bought it, and it has been transported with a barge on a river to another place. So even the desire to pass our architecture to the next to future generation is somewhere in some way somehow challenged by the possibilities that new technologies brings to us. And also the speed of physical social transformation has been pushed by the Industrial Revolution. And this put architecture in different relative time frames. So the links that govern the coordinated patterns of cycles of financing, design, construction, perception, user, and use of this part has been changed a lot. So this is a very famous image of a theater in Detroit that has been transformed in the Parker's Place that tells us something about the relationship between speed and architecture. So about this relationship, there are some books, some interesting. So a very important book, it is by an historian, Marshall Berman, All That Is Solid Melts into Air, The Experience of Modernity, that it is a book that collects different essays, but one of them, it is about the building of a freeway that cut into the Bronx neighborhood in New York. This is Boston, but the image was quite interesting because that is what the new infrastructure did into the cities. They disrupted the relationship between buildings and disrupted the public space, and also the relationship between people. So the modernization is a drama. In a way, all the books is about the relationship between modernity as something positive, there's something about freedom, personal freedom of people, freedom from religion, from society bindings, and so on, the society bounds. And the modernization, that is something that has externalities like pollution, noise, danger, and so on. So it is quite interesting how the two are connected and in a way are the two faces of the same coin. The title of the books come from a passage of the Manifesto of the Communist Party by Marx and Engels. This is the passage. It's quite interesting because this conflict between modernity and modernization is very clear in this passage, because it says that there is a sort of fascination of the outcomes of modernity, but also we are threatened in a way, we are afraid of them. So in Marx, it is always very clear, this double attitude, an attraction for the modernity, and also the fear of its outcomes. And of course, Marx is a very smart writer, and all that fascination of modernity is rendered in a very, very beautiful way. Another book that I would suggest you is this one by Stephen Kerr, The Culture of Time and Space, which addresses the late 19th century, in which there was a sort of very fast coordination of times between different places. So the idea that time and space are very connected, and there are also in this book very interesting arguments about the arts and how modern arts were involved with this different perception of time and space together. Another interesting author is Paul Virilio. Virilio wrote some dozens of books, but this one, L'Espace Critique, is very telling about the relationship between the new media. New media are very fast, you know, very well, and the space of the city. So, and including within this very large category of new media, also the fast mobility within the city. So the idea that if you take a metro line, you start, especially if it is underground, you start in a place and you come back in a very, and you go outside in a very, very different place. So you take together, for instance, the periphery and the center in very few minutes. And it is a very weird experience compared to the experience you had in a normal space-time in other times. Okay, let's go on. So our experience today and the experience of architecture in a way is very similar to the experience of telling story as framed by Italo Calvino, who told us that a story, but I can say architecture, is an operation carried out on the length of time involved, an enchantment that acts on the passage of time, either contracting or dilating it. If you are going to design an infrastructure or the architecture connected with the infrastructure, this is something that you have to keep in mind, that space and time are connected, and we operate on time as well as on space. So one of the problems of architecture, especially of modern architecture tried to ride the tiger of the very fast time, but it was as well threatened by it and also harmed by it, as you see in this very famous image of Maison Savoie by Le Corbusier. And many of the attempts of modern architecture to keep pace with the modern times were failures. So there is this nice book of Peter Blake, which in a way tries to address all the problems that modern architecture met trying to keep pace with modernity. There was, of course, a reaction. The history of architecture is made of all this sort of dialogue between avant-gardes and reactions. So, especially in Italy after the World War II, in a way, World War II was a sort of manifestation of speed on many levels. So the reaction after the war, especially in places like Italy, where we had a sort of the fascist rhetoric was very ambiguous about speed and about tradition. So the reaction after the World War II and the reaction against fascism was a sort of coming back to the architecture before fascism. So an idea of of nostalgia to sort of recovering of the society before the modernization brought by fascism. On the other hand, the effects of light of the 20th century life bring into the city very different conditions and outcomes. And there are some books that addressed it. Two are very interesting and very famous. This was one by Rainer Banham, The Architecture of Four Ecologies. And one of the ecology is precisely the one of the freeways, which is addressed by Banham like as a sort of autonomous environment that produced also a specific architecture. This is an example of the so-called Goji style, which is precisely connected with the perception from the car. Another book, very famous, and I bet you already met it. It is Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown's Learning from Las Vegas, which is a sort of attempt to understand the new environment produced by the car. You see, this is a very telling image in which the architecture is completely covered, or it is completely disappeared and covered by signs and written communication. So graphics and words are the environment for the speed, for the fast perception. Of course, there are again a reaction against this situation, because architects are, let's say, up to defend their discipline. So me and Alessandro, we are from a generation that were educated within this reaction against speed, against modernity. So with an idea of coming back to a more traditional idea of architecture. Of course, this was a very difficult endeavor, because the idea was to recreate a sort of pastime, the spontaneous conscience of even preceding the architectural expertise, as in Quaroni, Ridolfi, and Muratori's approach. So the idea is to build up this sort of spontaneous approach from architects. This is paradoxical and quite impossible to get, because as Los underlined, we are architects because we learn Latin. We made grand tours, so we are intrinsically international and not spontaneous. We are experts in a way. So, however, that the evolutionary approach of Saverio Muratori was a theoretical reference, for example, for the School of Venice, where I learned architecture. And against it proposes an idea, an evolutionary idea. So the idea of Aldo Rossi, maybe it is here. It is a sort of idea of duration. This theory of locus is something about the duration of the big buildings, the duration of the urban space that can withstand the time and house very different functions. So the idea of Rossi is that architecture, okay, it is connected with function as a starting point, but architecture should be thought as something that can withstand the time beyond the first functional starting point. So the idea is to design architecture that are in a way redundant, let's say generous, trying to spend some money more than the first problem architecture is called to address. Okay. So these values of permanence is in his architecture and the architecture of his followers translated into something of metaphysical. So this is sort of urban space that we experienced in recent times, unfortunately. But it is something that the architecture of La Tendenza, so the movement that was started by Aldo Rossi, in some way, let's say it is the goal of their architecture, something that it is, let's say, disconnected from the contingent reality, and something that can be consistent in time, and ideological without the people inside. So time conceived in this manner, it is a sort of suspended time, something that stays still, and it is connected with this Greek idea of time. You know, Greeks had two words for time. Aion is the time of duration, and chronos is the time of transformation. So this idea of architecture is about the time of duration. And this is a Florentine magazine that ideologically put Aion as its title in order to make us understand that it is about this sort of architecture. Also, the practice of composition, it is the discipline that we are supposed to teach. It is a practice that tries to withstand the time, so to resist the wear of time, and also corpses are composed for burial, but we know that even corpse decompose, and even architecture has to decompose in a long time. So Aldo Rossi masterpieces are ambiguous from this time point of view, because this is probably one of the most celebrated of his architecture. But if you go there, it is a very weird experience because it is very badly built. So this idea of resisting time and of decay are connected, and you see this is a cemetery, and it is done like a corpse. You see, there is the ribs and the head and so on. Okay, but his masterpiece is probably the Teatro del Mondo, the World Theater, which is something that moves, and it is a temporary architecture, which is completely weird if you think about Aldo Rossi's theories and architecture. So at the end, this Marxist generation was involved in those commercial malls, like this one by Aldo Rossi in the outskirts of Parma, which is an architecture connected with speed. So, you know, commercial mall has always a parking place in front of them, because you have to say to the people who is going on the road that you can stop there to buy something. So it is very interesting that an architect who was the theoretician of the architecture of the city ended up in producing the contrary of the city, the very opposite architecture of his theory. So historical postmodernism was something that started as a point of resistance against the transformation of the architecture, of the representation of the speed in architecture, but as Cole has pointed out, is something that ended up in the very style of the generic city. So something that was so efficient to keep pace with the speed of design requested by the postmodern society. And Aldo Rossi again. Aldo Rossi was a very smart man. Was one of the fastest in understanding it and trying to produce the facades that the postmodern architecture requested. This is an hotel in Japan, of which Rossi designed just the facade and probably the interior of the bar. All the other interior space were designed by the other architects. So the theoretician of the relationship between typology and morphology produce at the end facades. So it is a sort of destiny that architects are in a way up to face, that produce architecture which is opposite to their theories. So the repetition of the stylistic elements that you can find in postmodern architecture is a sort of device that is something that can be used in a very fast way. I just produced one postmodern project when I was young for a competition. It was very fast to design it because you have a sort of grammatic catalog of elements. You just to put them one on top of the other, and the architecture is done in a very, very fast way. So it was very efficient in a way. So in the same times in which the Italian neorealist architects was producing that nostalgic architecture, other architects, other also artists like Constant produce a very different organization of the cities. This is New Babylon. New Babylon is a sort of utopian project in which people were supposed to move continuously. So this is a sort of a hyper-connected labyrinth where people were supposed to stop whenever or wherever they wanted. And you see there are also these lines on the ground because people were also supposed to take high-velocity trains and connect different parts of the world very rapidly. And people were free to do that because everything was done by machines. So machines were in the underground, and everything was the people was set free by the work and by family, and so they moved all the time. So it is quite interesting utopia. Also, the utopian thought thinking by Johanna Friedman, who passed away recently, was about the idea of a big infrastructure where people were supposed to move and also were supposed to be free to build their own home, their own house. So this utopian time started in the late 50s and went on till the 70s, more or less. Began to transform the early fascination for the machine of the modern architects like Le Corbusier, and transforming it from the plane of representation, from the level of the representation of this futuristic idea of the city to something more operative, something that can be managed by diagrams. So the idea was to set the people free to design their buildings and to design it in a very rapid way, in a way compressing the feedback cycles and overlapping the mediation role of the architects. So this period, as I told you before, starting in the late 50s and going on in the two following decades, has some consequence in the present times. You can see the idea of as something of dynamic, not only in the experience of driving on the highways, but also in the spirit of buildings. This, ironically, now it is a sort of monument. It is a protected building in Japan. Also, me too. I signed a petition to protect this building because it was up to be demolished. But the idea of Kisho Kurokawa was to have this sort of capsules to be moved in other places. So the idea of movement started to influence also the idea of buildings. So even buildings was something of mobile. Cedric Price, for instance, take the opportunity of some railways that were available in this place in England to think of a university that can be built on tracks. You see, there are wheels, and this part can be moved in order to build up the university, a sort of movable university that can keep pace with the changes that higher education always propose, and the possibility to organize the space according to the requests of new possibility for teaching and research. So the idea of architecture because something indeterminate, something that can continuously adapt to different conditions and requests. So this is a sort of inversion of the idea of architecture. So usually we think architecture as something that stays still, okay, and can house different function, but this idea is to adapt continuously the space to different requests. So the ideological immobility of architecture was challenged by this utopian project, even walking cities, like in this very famous drawing by one of the component of the group archigram. So in a way, the title of this Simon Sadler book, Architecture Without Architecture, is appropriate. It frames very well the idea of the utopian or the radical groups that try to find in architecture the possibility to making something fast. accelerated. This is a very famous drawing by Vittorio De Feo for a competition, a design competition for the new gas station. At the end, the competition, I think, was won by Costantino Dardi, who built an example in Mestre, near Venice. Again, these examples, this gas station was modified, but I think that something, it was preserved there. Anyway, this is my book of about the PhD and postdoctoral studies that I run in Venice, which are about all this problem of big dimension and velocity. So the impact of mobility about our perception, the condition of perception, brought some consequences. One of the consequences is the reduction to surface of architecture, because when you go very fast in a car, your vision is like a very, with a long focal length. You see things, you are naturally drawn to a very distant vision, because you have to anticipate the danger you can face driving. So you look very, very far. And this far gaze it is a gaze that makes things flat on a surface. So it is more effective for for architecture to have a graphic sign than to produce a sort of volumetric experience. So the architecture that has a relationship with the speed is an architecture that is hybridizing its expertise with graphics, advertising, cinema, and graphic design especially. So in that period, we are in the 60s. There was also the need to involve architecture in participation. There is something that is very how to say up to date also right now, and there is this project by Cedric Price again, which is a sort of ever-changing architecture. Maybe I have another image. You see it. There are cranes and panels that can be connected in very different ways in order to build up big theaters like this one, or single rooms for every activity the customers can ask to the computer. It was also sort of disrupting research by Cedric Price, also together with along with cybernetics, in order to devise a software able to manage all the working of this big sort of total fun palace. Okay, of course, when we talk about fast and fast design, the fast design experience is the one of fashion, because you are supposed to change everything for every season. So this is something, again, problematic for architecture, because as me and Alessandro were told, fashion is the devil. So architecture that follows fashion is an architecture that in some way surrender to the sirens of capitalism. But I think that since we are Italian, we know very well that one of the few things that work, works in Italy is fashion. And maybe we have a lot to learn from fashion design. And I think that this idea of design is something that is more it is larger than the usual realm of architecture is quite teaching for us, especially when we approach, when we address architectural problems that are at the limit of our scope. And I think that working on freeways, on speed, on these known places as Marc Auger framed them. It is something that pushes the limits of our discipline, and I think that trying to superimpose our expertise to other cases is very, very interesting. Of course, there was a time in the first 2000s that architecture and fashion overlapped their expertise. There was a period in which Rem Koolhaas, but also Renzo Piano, Tadao Ando, Toyo Ito, Kazuo Sejima, Herzog and Meron, everybody built up showrooms for fashion designers, for fashion firms. And also this book by Mark Wigleys tells us that this is not a very recent thing, because also the master of modernism were deeply involved in fashion design. Besides Loos, who wrote about fashion a lot, but even Gropius, Corbusier, even Mies were a lot involved in this part of designing things. And I think that is something that it is telling. And by the way, the book of Mark Wigleys is a very, very nice book, and it is something that you should read now or maybe in the next years. So I have to. I'm sorry for you, but my English is decaying always. It always happened this way. As long as I talk, my English gets worse. But I mean, I will try to end the presentation in a short time. So we are in our design profession. We are dealing always with this problem of changing issues. We are clients that continuously change their requests. So there are some projects that try to address this problem. This is one by MVRDV, the Dutch firm, Dutch office that try to detect in time. You see, this number is the date, and according to the change of the dates, there are always functional difference. And this curve, it is a curve of Gauss. It is a curve that tries to describe and describe the function that are possibly collected into this building. So this is a sort of surface diagram that try to cope with the different requests in time of the clients. And the building, you see, it is a sort of crystallization of this process in time. So the office devised different sort of facades and different sort of typology. They are simply stacked one on top of each other in order to get this sort of very weird building that, by the way, is also contextual, because this is a former harbor So a port, a commercial port in which containers are stacked on the harbor. So it is a sort of strategy that it is quite smart because it addresses the problem of the design speed and also the problem of context together. Another architect that tried to organize the project in times is Eduardo Arroyo. Again, both Vinny Mas and Eduardo Arroyo worked in Rem Koolhaas' office in the 90s, so probably Koolhaas is the starting point for their attitude towards time. So the idea of Eduardo Arroyo is more biological. So his project is not always, but often sort of biological endeavor. So they grow from starting from parameters and hypotheses, and the outcome is always something that wasn't in the mind of the architects as a starting point. So the ability of the architect is right now to try to use all this sort of threatening, changing features of the present times, the speed that we are going to deal with within the design process, even the speed that the building has to deal with in its afterlife. So try to use optimistically that threatening conditions. And this is a book by Manuel Gauss and other authors that collects projects that turn the difficulties of the present times in something, in starting points to get more interesting projects. So the text I think is finished, but I have the postscriptum with some books that you can look at in order to understand how this problem of speed is addressed in the present time. I should say that all these things of cars is a little bit went outside of the present debate because of the different approach that younger generation have towards the car. So the cars was for the modernist generation something very disruptive, something that there is this very interesting book by Beatrice Colomina about privacy and publicity in architecture, and she frames the Le Corbusier attitude to put always his car in front of the building he photographed. So the car was a sort of measure of the present times for the modernist architects. And even for my generation, the car was something of our identity. So if you see the car of an old man like me, I'm 60 right now, so the car is something that tells something about that man. Okay, if I have a Ferrari, I have a sort of architect. For instance, Aldo Rossi had owned an Aston Martin at the time, and then he died in a car accident in a Volkswagen Golf, if I remember well. But of course, these are some of our anecdotal short stories. Let's keep focused on the lecture. So, some books. This one is quite interesting because amnesia is a sort of characteristic or feature of speed. So this is an interesting, as always, Perspecta is a monographic magazine, architectural journal, in which always there are focused the very deeply those arguments. Amnesia is something very interesting for me. It is something that architecture has to deal with, and I mean, this is an interesting reference. And also the Sylvia Lavin books is about where is Sylvia Lavin? Is trying to address the temporary and the obsolete and the evolutionary. So how architecture can keep pace with different conception of time. Okay, Sylvia Lavin is a smart writer, and her books are always very interesting. This is a book of Cedric Price in a conversation with Hans-Ulrich Obrist, and there is other very important protagonist of recent architecture. It is his sort of testament. And also about velocity and about speed, there is this important book by Rem Koolhaas. Other reference, but I think there is, yes, okay, it is 10:30, so it is time to stop. I go to the end. Okay. Paul Virilio, I already quoted him. Virilio founded a new science, dromology, a science based on speed. So if you are interested of this on these issues, probably Virilio is a reference that you have to deal with. So I put the cover of another very important, is an art curator, Germano Celant, who passed away last week. An art curator, but who was very keen to understand all the different realms of design. So he was very curious. He was a friend, for instance, of Gino Valle, friends of architects, and again, if you are going to understand this problem of speed from different point of view, it could be a good reference for you. And also, there are books that try to address this overlapping of fashion and architecture in an interesting way. Of course, there are also books that try to forget about speed and try to make architecture resist against these threats. Okay, so I'm, as Alessandro told you before, a quite prolific writer. So there is this academia.edu website in which you can find the things that I wrote, that I write and wrote. So I'm also a public person. If you have question, even beyond the time of this seminar, you can write me. Okay, thank you very much for your patience. And yes, Alessandro.
Okay. Thank you very much, Giovanni. Thank you for the great lecture. Very, very large and very, in a way, not trying different approaches. Is like a wandering through books, words, images, memories. So is, in a way, I think is a very easy lecture to follow because it's very interesting. It's not easy to keep out from that a clear message in a way, because it's more like a series of problems, a series of memories and of accidental relations between things that between concepts, images, books that normally are not in relation. So this is a networking through architectural culture that is a beautiful exercise, and I think is very stimulating and can really help us in thinking differently the things we know and the project we are making. Just for I was joking, no? Extracting the keywords of your lecture. What are the keywords for me in your lecture? And for me, they are, for example, the one is a techno-utopia, no? Techno-utopia, because I was really a techno-utopia and is an authoritarian utopia. So the concept, the idea, the feeling that we are working into an utopian system is very, I think, helpful in understanding how we have to manage that environment. Another word, of course, is dystopia. No? It's a community of society that is undesirable or frightening. Highway is undesirable and frightening for many aspects, and this is also a character that is not necessarily negative, that can help in imagining a new architectural interpretation of that place, of transformation of those places. Another interesting word that you mentioned is amnesia. No? Amnesia is a deficit in memory caused by brain damage or disease. So also passing through an highway is an experience that provokes amnesia, that in a way push you to cancel your precedent memories, putting another environment in the place of the usual environment. No, you are in a detached circuit, in detached place. Another very interesting concept that you mentioned is the anachronism. No, highway is like is dystopic, is anachronistic in many ways. No, is for us, for example. For me, is very related with the past in a way, with the very ultra-modernist society based on movement, based on interaction between distant places, a very Marshall Berman-like experience of destruction through the transformation. But also, of course, there is also something about future in the highway, something about the production of different and new theaters, of new conditions. Another word is for me should be events, but this is another of the keywords of your book, so I don't enter into that because it should open a larger field of discourse. So thank you very much. I ask everybody, colleagues and students, to make any comment or questions to Giovanni.
Am I supposed to answer at once?
If there are questions, yes, I think, yeah.
But even to yours?
Yes, of course.
May I comment something?
I would be honored.
So, okay, there are many words. You nominated 6 of them. So, I mean, technotopia and dystopia, of course, are deeply connected with this idea of speed. We get speed through technology. So, but I mean, right now, that technology is immaterial. So it is something that went on another level. So it is something that it allows us to talk in this way, to be in this virtual space without highways and with very immaterial issues and instruments. So probably this techno-utopia and dystopia is gone, is evaporated in the web, and probably is more dangerous right now. So it has not an architectural threatening image. I was thinking about the Morandis Bridge in Genova, which was not preserved, and it was a masterpiece of architecture. So it is quite interesting how the debate, a very conservative debate in Italy, was very keen to erase it suddenly without any voice against it. probably maybe one or two, told us that this was a monument, that something was done. So this is something that gets us into the amnesia issue. There is something that I would like to write about. Maybe I wrote something when I was involved in that recycle research, because recycle is about memory and amnesia together. We should we have to forget in order to recycle, otherwise we conserve. But memory is quite easy to get because you have machine to do it, but we have not machine to forget. So as Umberto Eco pointed out, it is very difficult to forget things. As long as you try to forget, you remember the things, because trying to forget things, when you finish a love story, it is very hard to forget, because any attempt you do, you have to forget things becomes something that keeps your love affair in your mind. So I mean, there is also social issues connected with this idea of different times within the freeways. For instance, there is this book by Alessandro Petti about the experience to move in the Palestine. In Palestine, if you are an Israeli or if you are a Palestinian. So if you are from Israel, you can go in 1 hour from one place to another in a freeway. If you are a Palestinian, you take maybe more than 1 day to make the same trip, because there are in other words, the highway is a connecting infrastructure, but it is also a border, something that has to do with social differences, and the people who use the freeways is often different from the people who undergoes the freeway. So if the freeways pass into your garden, you are not very happy. But if you are a public person, as we are, I live in Padua, I work in Turin, I'm always traveling. So the infrastructure is something positive for me. This is the same divide that we have in Italy against the high-speed train. Okay, I love it. But there are people who doesn't love it because they who don't love it because they stay in a place, they have the work in that place, they don't use the big infrastructure. So infrastructure is a tricky term. Okay, I don't know if there are questions.
Yes, I would like also ask Andrea Jacopo to make any comments, and students, of course, and of course Alberto, if you like to say anything.
I was very interested about. Sorry, Giovanni. I was very interested about this idea of reducing architecture to the surface, because I think that it is one of the main. I mean, while I was preparing this lesson, researching on the archives of the Autogrill and the architect Bianchini, he was calling these buildings advertising architecture. So something which, of course, reminds us very much of learning from Las Vegas, from this idea that architecture is just reduced to a billboard, as Venturi was saying. And I think that this is one of the key issues. So how can these places still remain spaces, or if they just become just a flat advertising that has to capture us in this fraction of time in which we can decide either to stop by or to continue, maybe stop in the next station.
Yes, of course, there is a keyword about surface, so in which I addressed all these issues. I remember there is this book by Pashkarev and another author that I don't remember right now. It is Man-Made America, in which all this relationship between infrastructure and the space outside of the infrastructure is addressed. And I get the idea of the reducing on surface from this book. And I also interviewed many years ago Gino Valle, who was an architect who worked building sheds outside of the freeways, worked with this idea of super graphics, and he was very keen to address in his architecture the problem of speed, and even his Monumento della Resistenza in Udine is done according to the movement of the car and the different experience of the people who is inside, who is standing inside the monument, standing still, and the people who is driving around the monument. So you have very different condition of perception, and this architecture is quite interesting in a way it addresses the different conditions. For instance, in this monument of the resistance in Udine, there is a big fountain with very noisy water that isolated you from the noise of the cars. So it is quite interesting how the experience in the same place, because you can see the cars, the roof of the car going outside of this big roundabout, but you cannot listen to them, you cannot hear them, and it is quite interesting, the solution.
Yes, I have a comment. First of all, I would like to thank you, Giovanni, for the presentation. It was very inspiring from my point of view. I have uploaded a sketch, which are my notes taken during your presentation. I'm also glad that Giovanni mentioned the word surface, because I think that in the end, what is interesting is to understand the relationships between inside and outside. When we are inside the car, we are kind of inside the box, and everything which is outside is the landscape, and there is a surface which is the screen on which the relationship between inside and outside takes place. So what we call the wind screen, okay, the surface of glass which is separating us from the experience that we are having inside a car, maybe when we are listening to music or conversating, and what is happening outside. So the screen is the place that is also changing a lot today. So there is a contemporary comment that we can make thinking about a contemporary situation, about the way a screen is changing, because it is the surface on which information is appearing. Some navigators are already working in that way, projecting on the screen the information rather than keeping the information on the screen of the navigator itself. So I think that the communication and considering the screen as a kind of interface between inside and outside, between artificial facts like the car and natural facts like the landscape around, is the key issue that also our students are trying to interpret. Of course, there is a difference between the speed of the movement while you're moving and the calm and the quiet and the not fast movement of the landscape. But again, the interaction between the two, I think, is an important keyword. So I thank you for having outlined these keywords, and I think that they are very useful also for our students to think about what they are designing in this moment. And also another point is the point of time, of durability. Sustainability has to do with the possibility of things to last over time. So it is important to think about sustainability in terms of durability also. Okay, sustain is the pedal of the piano. Okay.
Yes, this is a tricky
sound, yeah.
It is a tricky issue, no? Because durability is something that make our pollution very standing, very lasting in time. So there are different approaches. Something that say we have to produce biodegradable houses, and other they say, okay, if you use energy, we have to use this energy in a way that we can repay it in a long time. It is tricky. I would like to say just something about this idea of the screen, because you know everything is going to change very rapidly with unmanned cars. There are cars already designed by Volvo, if I remember well, where you can sleep inside. So we will be very efficient workers. I imagine my life sleeping in the car, going to Torino, working and going back to Padua, again sleep in the car in order to make us more efficient. So not looking outside of the screen. And there is also a research by Max Swan that is now they changed the name. By Max Swan is again a Dutch office of architecture and urbanism in the late 90s, or maybe in the first 2000. They produced the research for the Ministry of Public Works in the Netherlands. They always finance very interesting researches, in which they devised the scenario of the freeways with the unmanned vehicles. So the idea of compression of the vehicles, because the vehicles can drive very close one to each other, and a landscape without signs, because people are not supposed to look at the sign for the exit of the freeway or where to go, because the car does it without any help. So it was a very interesting research, because it shows a very different landscape. No, because even the spaghetti junctions are going to disappear, because with the unmanned cars, they are not, they can smooth the flow of the cars without spaghetti junction, because they just communicate one car to each other, so they can pass very, very rapidly without in a normal cross junction. Okay, so in a normal crossroad. So everything is up to change, but maybe not so rapidly. I mean, we are already producing degree thesis about this scenario, what to do with parking places, for instance, because cars are up to go every time. So they are going to move always to be used. We probably won't need 2 cars or 3 cars in a family, but we will need 1 or maybe none of them. So everything is up to change. And even as I was saying before, the sort of loving relationship between people and cars, and also between people and infrastructure. Probably I like infrastructure. I think that the Autostrada of del Sole is a masterpiece, and I was very, when they tore down the Ponte Morandi, I was very, very sad, because our infrastructure are beautiful.
Yes, I was also very sad when nobody commented. I know in front of a tragedy, probably there is a reaction of try to demolish and to forget about the past and to go forward. But no one really commented about the aesthetic value of that infrastructure, and that
Yes.
I think is a great pity, because we conservate every small stone in Italy, and sometimes we are crazy about it's not even conservation or restoration. It's like taxidermy. I don't know the English word for taxidermy. I think it is for imbalsamare. So it's a kind of artificial attitude of maintenance in life of things that are really dead. So I also agree.
But Alessandro knows very well that I am for the amnesia, so it wasn't possible for me to write something to defend the Ponte Morandi. Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
There are any other comments? Jacopo, you want to say anything?
No, I just want to thank again Giovanni, because it was really interesting, and because of the richness of the different things that he showed us. That is very interesting also for the students, because he demonstrated that there was no determinism in facing such a theme. So there is no because we were talking when we were speaking about the highway. Yes, we used to try to define which are the characters of the building that should be on the highway, which are the things that designers must respect some way. But the richness of the approaches that Giovanni showed us today really showed that there is not, let's say, an infrastructural determinism given by this site, this specific site, but it always the design intention of the architects that is more important. And then of course there are many things that also in this discussion that were very interesting about the inequality of infrastructure. And it reminded me Robert Moses parkways with the bridges that are too low for the buses to go there, so black people at the time couldn't go to the beaches. And then also the idea of image, it's very bidimensionality is very interesting, because it's also something that keeps together all the references that Giovanni showed us, including Aldo Rossi, because it's true, Aldo Rossi permanence is not for the building but for the shape, and the shape is very much. He was an extraordinary scenographer more than an extraordinary architect. I mean builder, not architect. So there are many things. I don't want you to steal time, because there would be also, as I wrote here, also the Gino Valle
Theater in Vicenza.
In Vicenza. Then you enter in a lower level, so you see just the top of the trees and the urban wall, but you not see the. So I don't want to steal time. Thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Jacopo. Nice to meet you. Surface is the keyword also as a sort of method of research. All my keywords are very flat and superficial. So it is a sort of tool for the people who want to get deep into the arguments, but it is something that connects things in a surface of the debate. They are not something that address depth. So surface, it is something connected with the speed of the research also.
Okay, so thank you very much. And now we can have a coffee break of...
Fantastic.
Now is 11. We can have a coffee break of 15 minutes maybe, and 11:15 Alberto starts with this lecture. I'm sorry, we have a little delay, but we have
my fault.
We have the entire morning. I hope that you have to. Okay. Okay. So thank you very much.
See you later.
See you here in some minutes less than 15.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.